Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. My name is Pilar and I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, a company where we help managers of remote teams to get the most out of online collaboration. You can find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com. Hello and welcome to a very special episode of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. If we haven't met before, my name is Pilar and this podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant. And today's a bonus and special episode because we've got some research to tell you about, and actually we have one of the people that did this research with us, which is quite unusual, I have to say. One, that the research is current enough to really want to bring it live on the show, and two, that we've got the person who looked at it. So I would like to introduce to you today my guest. She is Wietske van Osch, and she holds the Canada Research Chair in Enterprise, Social Media and Digital Collaboration at HEC Montreal, and she's the Associate Professor at Michigan State University. So welcome, Wietske.
Hello. Hi. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to connect and be here. Thank you.
Yeah, and connect is indeed what we did, and I think it's worth just saying how we connected, because this is one of the wonders of the 21st century work life, is that even when you are a freelancer or when you're working in this medium, you can connect with people across the world. And just by sharing a bit of what you're doing, you make great connections. So I actually went into one of the communities I'm part of. It's a community hosted by Rachael Happe, who actually appeared on this show in August 2022 talking about engaged communities. And I just posted there and said, I've come across this research. It's probably interesting for all of you. And then Laurie said, hey, I know one of the researchers. And so very kindly, you've agreed to come on the show. So thank you very much. It's lovely to have you.
My pleasure.
Let's tell listeners a bit about, I think it's interesting to hear how you got in this field of collaboration. But before that, of course, I'll put the link in the show notes, although it's in a magazine. We do have the link. So the title of the research, in case you want to Google it as you're listening to this, is The Profound Influence of Small Choices in Digital Collaboration. And it appeared in the MIT Sloan Management Review in the fall issue of 2023. So before we go into more detail about this, how did you end up in the field of digital collaboration?
Yeah, so as a PhD student, I actually looked at collaborative creativity in online communities, peer-to-peer file sharing communities, open source software communities. And that was because I've always been interested in creativity. Actually, as a kid, I always loved to do creative things, was always very hands-on. I built my own doll furniture. I would invent new recipes. And over time, as I was studying, I realized that this passion for doing creativity translated into a passion for understanding creativity. When I did my master's, I had to do a thesis project at some point, went to Silicon Valley, where really the world of innovation sort of opened up, right? I looked at creative collaborations in a real world organization, and then continued studying that in the context of online communities, as I said. But after I finished my PhD and I joined Michigan State University as an assistant professor at the time, it was 2012, was really when these enterprise social media platforms started taking off, right? A lot of organizations started experimenting with platforms like Jive, Beehive, Yammer. And being in Michigan, I reached out to Steelcase, which is headquartered in Michigan. And I was like, well, Steelcase is known to be such a creative organization, right? They do a lot of collaborations. They're global. Let's see if they use one of these platforms. And coincidentally, it turned out they had just implemented one of these platforms. And so there was this sort of mutual interest. I wanted to understand better what organizations were doing with these platforms. And Steelcase wanted to understand better what their employees were doing and if there was a payoff from having such a platform, right? What are the benefits of having a platform like that? So that sort of sparked a decade-long research collaboration, really understanding digital collaboration in the context of these community platforms.
Have you been looking at digital collaboration this widely, or do you also look at what happens within teams, or is it always these bigger communities that you are interested in?
No, so I actually look mostly at teams in the context of organizations. So, but I've really looked at various levels of research, right? So initially, when I started looking at these platforms, I wanted to have a better understanding of how people were using it. And I really looked at the individuals, right? Like, how do people engage with these platforms? What are the different ways that users communicate or participate in these platforms? And how do these different ways of participating, of contributing, bring value to the organization? So that was really at the individual level. But then soon I realized that these platforms are really ideal spaces for what we sometimes in the literature call boundary spanning, right? In organizations, in order for project teams to be successful, they need to share knowledge, they need to share ideas, they need to share expertise across boundaries in the organization. Those boundaries are often team level boundaries, but they could also be geographic, cultural, department boundaries. And so that's really what I started looking at, right? Like the way teams exchange knowledge, ideas, expertise across the boundaries of the team, but in the context of the broader organization. And of course, in the context of many of these community platforms, what is a team is not always so clear cut, right? People create group spaces. Do these group spaces necessarily overlap with a team? Or oftentimes they're larger than a team because it's sort of a group of people with similar interests in the organization that get together, which might not map one-on-one to an actual official project team in the organization.
Yeah, that's very important, that distinction of the groups that get formed online, these communities within a community platform that get formed online, which I think if you're part of an organization and you've never experienced it, I think sometimes it's difficult to get your head around. I remember at the beginning of when these platforms were being introduced, departments would open a group that was just for their department in Yammer because we didn't have Microsoft Teams as well. So really interesting, that distinction.
Indeed.
So, okay, so we got you to the point where you went, can I play? And they said yes. And you've already started to tell us a bit what you wanted to explore. How do you start a piece of research like this? I am so curious.
Yeah, so that was rather complicated, right? Because there's actually a really nice side to it. You know, traditionally as researchers, we often do surveys, we do interviews, but it's all self-report data, right? We rely on what people say. And we know from decades of research that what people say they do is often not really a reliable reflection of their real world behavior, especially when we study things like creativity, right? People always want to appear more creative than they really are in reality. So the beauty of these platforms is that there's actual content there that people share, that they generate. So instead of asking people necessarily what they do, we can look at their actual behaviors, their actual interactions, and study those. In addition to that, I think these platforms also, because they're inherently in a way networking platforms, right? People build connections, whether these connections are one-on-one or they're connected by being members of the same group or the same channel. It really allows us to be able to study how network structures of teams, of groups, of communities evolve over time, because we have the actual existence of paths, let's say, right, ties between people in the platform, or as they said, between communities. So studying it can be challenging, right, because we need to develop really different methods for looking at that. We need to figure out ways that we can assess the content of conversations. And I can maybe tell a little bit more about it as we really start talking about the project, so it's not so abstract and it's more specific to the project. It will be easier to understand. But I think that's the beauty of these platforms, right? That we can really look at what people are doing rather than just what they're saying that they're doing. And that's not to say that the other type of research is not valuable. Indeed, in my own research of these platforms, I often combined looking at what is happening with surveys or interviews with actual users to better understand, okay, why is this happening, right? Why are people behaving a certain way? Because that really adds sort of more meaning to the findings by just looking at the data itself.
Yeah, God, fascinating. I could go off on all tangents, but I'm going to stick to this. So then let's go specifically. So this is the broad. Yes. So this is in a way starts to touch on the methodology. So what did you set out to look specifically?
Yeah, so I said earlier how initially didn't really know what I was looking for,
Yes.
right? And part of the agenda was shaped by Steelcase at the time as well, because they indicated that they just wanted to better understand what is happening in these platforms, and they had a couple of strategic priorities. So I tried to align my interest a little bit with that to also be able to give them a better understanding of what happened. So initially, I really looked at, okay, how do people behave? What do they do? How do they create value in different ways? And then from that, I soon realized that most of the value that is generated for an organization really happens in group spaces, not so much on individual profile pages, let's say. So I started looking at this concept of boundary spanning, right? The translation or the transfer really of ideas, the exchange of ideas, knowledge, and expertise across boundaries, across different groups inside this community platform. And I soon realized that about 80% of content that is being shared really transcends boundaries, right? So there's a lot of exchange that happens between groups, between channels. But I also soon realized that about 30% of that content that is being transferred, that's being exchanged, is creative in nature. So really focuses on creating new ideas, concepts, or products. So this sparked a strong interest in really having an understanding of, okay, what drives these creative dialogues, right? So I tried to call them creative dialogues because in the context of these platforms, everything is written conversations. So it's not really creativity in the traditional sense where we look at product development, but really creativity in the sense of having dialogues where people brainstorm ideas, where they think or envision new strategies, new products, etc. So initially, what I really set out to explore was, okay, what kinds of creative dialogues exist, right? Are they all the same thing? Is there just one type, or are there different kinds? And we soon realized that there is not a single type of creative dialogues, right? There are different kinds that exist. And then also, ultimately, what I really wanted to do was, once we understand the different types of creative dialogues that exist, and we start to understand what drives them, right? What are the characteristics of the team that result in greater levels of these dialogues? Can we reverse engineer? And can we build sort of a tool or an application inside these community platforms that allow teams to be more creative because we show them what helps them be creative? So let's take a very simple example. Let's say that we have a team where we see that there's one person named, let's call him John, that talks all the time, and he kind of dominates the conversation. No one else has a say. And that team is not doing very well in creativity because the ideas are just coming from one person. Nobody really dares to chime in and give feedback. And then we have another team where everyone is contributing very equally. And now we see that that team is doing much better. We could then create some sort of a visualization for teams as they're having conversations where it sort of shows the extent to which each person is speaking. And that might allow individual participants to self-adjust. Oh, like I'm talking the whole time, maybe I should take a step back and let someone else speak. Or the system might even pose questions like, hey, Jane, what do you think of this? Do you have any suggestions to make? So that could be a simple aspect that we could then take from this research, right? So that was really what I set out to explore. Do creative dialogues exist? Like, do they exist in the same form? Are there different forms? What drives them? And if we understand what drives them, can we help teams be more creative by helping them interact in more optimal ways, let's say?
Yeah, great. Loads in there. I want to pick up on a couple of things, especially for people who haven't had the experience of this kind of platforms, and also for people who are not used to online communities, again, because it's an interesting dynamic. So first of all, when these groups are being formed, for example, in the organization that you were working in, can you share, you might not be able, can you share what platform they were happening? And then some of the kinds of groups. So these groups form, what are the groups' names, or what are the conversations about? Just so we see what are people talking about?
Yeah, so the platform that they were using at the time, and at the time when I was working with multiple organizations, I think it was the most popular platform at the time was Jive. Obviously, we've seen over the years that Jive has sort of swindled down a little bit, and we see other platforms now being much more dominant, like especially Microsoft Teams, as you already mentioned. But we saw a whole range of groups, right? So there were groups that had nothing to do with work, that were on hobbies like cycling or planting or whatever it may be. And then there were groups that were specific, like you already mentioned earlier, to entire departments, right? Where departments could pose questions. There were groups that were more focused on tech support, right? People could post their questions if they had any issues with their computer or with a software tool. And then there were groups that were formed to really work on projects that were really related to actual project teams inside the organization. That's actually for the research that was published in this MIT Sloan Management Review article. We focused only on those groups that were more project teams. To really understand, okay, what happens there. But the groups are very diverse. So as I said, groups for hobbies, groups for problem solving, more like almost bulletin board type groups, and then very small groups where people are very passionate about a particular work topic and try to problem solve, brainstorm, etc.
Yeah, I think you're just making me think that it's so interesting if you haven't been in one of those places to visualize that, because if we make the comparison, which we still make a lot with the co-located world with the in-person, you probably would have the project team would be in one kind of environment. The people talking about cycling would be in another kind of place. But when we're in an online platform, we're all in the same space.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's just another thing to get our heads around. And then one thing that you mentioned, which I think is really important. So you were talking then coming into the team level, so to the team space, which we will focus on anyway. That's where the research was. And you gave the example of John, who's always talking, and the one team where one person dominates the conversation and the other one where they don't, and how by showing the different communication patterns, you can help the group to, in a way, self-organize and self-direct to make that conversation more equal. But you also mentioned, you didn't use the word prompt, but you mentioned how the system can intervene in this. And I think that's a really interesting point that many, especially managers, are missing, that the technology can help us to facilitate that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's not really part of this article per se, but that's really where my research agenda is going now, right? Especially since we're in the era of AI. What can be the role of what I call persuasive AI tools to persuade users to behave in ways that help them, right? To empower users of these platforms, to empower teams that collaborate through these platforms, to improve their creativity, to improve their collaboration by really having an in-depth understanding of sort of the factors that drive successful collaboration in the digital workplace. Now, there's many other questions that come with that, right? Like, do people trust the recommendations that are made by such a tool? How do we want to frame them that people are likely to want to accept it or to follow that? How do we ensure that we don't breach privacy and like confidentiality of information, right? Like, can we do that at an aggregate level? So we strip it of personalized information and it's more based of a general assessment of the platform. So people don't feel like they're being observed with every step that they take, and then they might abandon these platforms, right? So I think this is something where we have to thread very carefully out of respect to the users. So what I call persuasive AI, for me, it's important that we create sort of recommendation tools that empower users, but are respectful of ethical issues that exist in the workplace. So it's really about empowerment more so than maximizing what is good for profit, let's say.
Yeah, nice. And I love that. And I hadn't come across the term persuasive AI, so that's one for my vocabulary. Thank you. Right. But I digress. Coming back to your study, we're looking at different types of creative dialogues in teams. So what did you find out?
Yeah, so we looked at data here from, as I said, the real platform in a real world organization. We focused on 215 teams, of which 109 teams were public teams and 106 teams were private. And we really started sort of from the literature on creativity, where there's been two dilemmas, right? We've seen that in recent years, with the move to digital platforms, digital workplaces, but even the redesign of traditional physical office spaces, everything has been about enhancing transparency and visibility, right? We create new physical spaces that are open, glass-based, and we've made communication a lot more naked, as we sometimes call it, for everyone to see. But this transparency has become a bit controversial, right? Some researchers have argued that it's great it increases knowledge sharing, it increases opportunities for learning. But at the same time, people have argued that it's not so much group transparency, it's actually the opposite, right? When people are shielded from the rest of the organization, when it's a small group that operates in private, it creates opportunities for safe experimentation, risk-taking, and idea incubation. And interestingly, we see that a similar debate sort of exists in the literature on social networks, right? Where people say, on the one hand, cohesive networks with many dense connections, people are very strongly connected, create more creative collaborations because they help to establish trust. They have a shared language that they speak. There are strong norms of reciprocity. I do something, someone is going to do something back because we're a dense group. And then there's this alternative perspective, right? It says that networks that are really sparse, where we bridge across different parts of the organization, that's good for creativity because it brings diversity, it brings more novelty into the team. So really what we started out with this project was saying, okay, what is good for creativity? Is it transparency, or is it privacy? And is it these sparse networks that are diverse, or is it these very dense networks where people trust each other? And then we said, like, well, if we really look at creative dialogues, they're not all created equally, right? There are different kinds of creative dialogues. And in the paper, we talk about two different ones, expansion versus reframing. And expansion is really when we take something existing ideas, concepts that are already there, and we either combine them in a new way, or we take them from one context. For instance, maybe we developed a solution for the classroom, and we see that it works really well for a doctor's office, for the interaction of a doctor with his patients. And so we take the solution from one context, apply it somewhere else. And then we have these reframing dialogues, which are much more disruptive, right? Like we really often take a step back and say, well, maybe the way we look at the problem is wrong. Maybe this is not what we should be solving. We should be solving this. And we so produce a completely novel view of the problem that exists. And now that posed a challenge, right? How do you study or classify these dialogues when you're in this platform where you have more than 200 teams, and these 200 teams have created over 10,000 conversations? So that's where a portion of the research methods came in, that we developed a new natural language processing approach, a new machine learning algorithm to classify these. Now that started from first training graduate students to classify a portion of the data by hand, and then taking that to ensure that there was high reliability, right? Like if people are not able to classify these different dialogues reliably, how's the algorithm going to do that? As we sometimes say, garbage in means garbage out. So we wanted to ensure that we had very reliable coding by the humans as the training data to produce the algorithm. And then once we had that, we could look at, okay, what affects these dialogues, right? Is it the same variables? Is it different variables? And specifically, we looked at data that we could extract from the system. So things like the group setting. And in this context, enterprise social media was really the perfect space to do this research, because groups, when they are being established, they have to choose, are we going to be public or are we going to be private? So we could address directly this sort of controversy in the literature. And also, as I mentioned earlier, because these are really networking platforms, we could calculate the nature of the network structure, if it was one that focused more on this bridging sparse ties, or more on bonds, cohesive ties within the group. So that's really where we started out from, right? Looking at how these dynamics combine. And so what we found is that these two different dialogues come from very different ways of groups connecting. So when groups are open, when they're transparent, they tend to evolve into networks that focus on bridging. Because, of course, when a group is open, anyone can decide to join. So it's not only people that get invited, but it's people from everywhere in the organization that might just stumble upon this group and think, oh, that's an interesting topic. I want to contribute, or I want to be a member. So we see that these transparent, open groups, they form network structures that are much more dispersed throughout the organization. And that results in these expansion dialogues, because they bring in a lot of diversity and a lot of serendipity. And on the other hand, we find that these private groups develop very strong bonding ties, right? Because they tend to be smaller. They consist of people that they invite, that they feel comfortable with. And so we get this environment that develops where there's strong trust, a shared language, shared understandings. And we see that reframing dialogues, so the ones that are more disruptive, tend to occur there, because it's a safe space where people feel comfortable to take risks, to experiment, to really think outside of the box.
The two things I've taken from this work is, one is we cannot be just talking about creativity like it's one thing, because it's got we know it's got stages, but also there's different qualities and different kinds of interactions that are going to give us different benefits.
Yeah.
Plus then how important it is to think about this public-private, and it's a decision. Sometimes this is reversible, isn't it? In some platforms, you can go from one to the other, but not both ways, is it?
So actually, in many platforms, you can change. But one thing that we found that was really interesting is that actually doesn't happen. So we looked at that in our research. Like, we were really interested in, like, do groups evolve, right? Do they go from private to public or public to private? And we see that doesn't happen. And actually, in the article that we published, we include two mini cases. And these mini cases are actually based on real threats from the real platform that we studied, right? And it's just a little summary of that. And you see in one of those threats, it's the situation where Elena is part of a group where they're really thinking about how can we apply logics and ideas from startup thinking, entrepreneurial thinking to a large organization? Can we adopt some of these agile methods as a large organization? And as they get to sort of a minimally viable concept for how they could do that, they talk about, shall we now make it a public group? Because we could really benefit from feedback of the broader organization. But people actually raised concerns, right? They said that, well, it's possible that comments that were made within this secret group, we don't want to make available to the company, because once you change your setting, your entire history becomes available too. And indeed, one person says explicitly, I made a few comments that I'd like to keep to a smaller audience, so I'd advocate for a new public group versus turning this one public. So the group is really protective of their identity as a secret group, right? It was part of why they dared to think outside the box, why they dared to come up with ideas that were very disruptive, very novel. And rather than opening up that whole history that might have contain failures, maybe controversial ideas. Now that they have this minimally viable concept, it might be better to create a new group that could then be used to sort of gather that feedback from the broader organization. So really what we found is that rather than changing the setting over time as the needs of the group might evolve, because of the risk of then opening up the past as well, the history, they often create a secondary space. And that's the beauty of these platforms, right? As you said earlier, too, in physical space, we cannot be part of different identities at the same time. Like, we either sit in an open office or we sit in a closed room. But here you could really do both in parallel, right? Or maybe oftentimes, as you said, too, sometimes these different forms of creativity might occur almost as sequences, right? People might start out with this safe space to be very risk-taking, experimental, and then sort of move into safer ground or getting feedback from the rest of the organization as they have established something that they feel comfortable sharing. And so we can see that sequencing in the way that they create groups in the platform.
Was there anything about the group dynamics that you looked at or saw? Anything that you could comment on?
So I think the group dynamics are a little bit captured through the measurement of the social network structure, right? Which really we know from existing research that these different structures represent very different group dynamics. So in a network that's more bridging oriented, people will not contribute as frequently. There will be more, as I said, sporadic contributions. The contributions might be more of, oh, this is my perspective, but without really engaging with what others are saying. Whereas we see that in these bonding networks, there's a lot of, let's call it friendly conflict, right? Because the people feel comfortable with each other. So they dare to challenge each other. They dare to push others to go further, to think further. So I think you see that the difference in dynamics is sort of captured through these different structures.
Yeah, this is all things I've seen, but I've never thought of them like this, and it's so clear. Also, I just have this is a curiosity question. Did you get to see, or your research collaborators, did you get to see any of the conversations? Did you get to be part of the groups, or everything was done through?
So we are not part of the group, and we're not part of these platforms when we study them. That would be probably too much to ask from any organization. But usually what we get is that we get a data dump, let's call it, that includes the conversations, but in anonymized form. So we strip them of the names of people. So the names that are in the MIT article are made up names, right? They're pseudonyms, because we just have user ID numbers. And that is just to protect the identity of the people that are part of the organization that are being studied.
That's fascinating.
But yeah, I read many real threats, and that was also just to be able to better understand what's going on, right? It's one thing to see the regression models, let's say, in the numbers that say, oh, X is related to Y. But then when you really start reading them and you see the stories come to life, and that's really why we included those 2 mini cases in the article, because I think that they really show how these 2 forms of creativity develop in different ways, right? How they evolve and sort of the different steps that happen, right? The group starts by making this choice. Are we going to be public or private? And this in and of itself is really interesting, right? In day-to-day life, how often do we really give thought to this decision? Oftentimes it's accidental, or we might instruct someone else, oh, can you create a channel for this purpose or for this project that we're working on? And the person asks, public or private? You choose, right? Or do whatever, or just make it private. So we might not give much thought, but we really show sort of the evolution, right? Like this step obviously comes first, because anytime someone creates a channel or a group space, that's the first decision that is made. And that decision has really profound implications for the network structures that develop. So as I mentioned earlier, we really see that these public groups develop very sparse, very far-reaching network structures where people are connected with many others elsewhere in the organization that they might not actually know. And on the flip side, these private groups tend to create very dense network structures where people have a lot of previous connections. They've worked often together already. They are part of other teams as well together, or other groups in the organization. And that then in turn really results in different kind of conversations that people are having.
So is there anything else that you found during the study that might not have been in the article?
Yeah, so I think one thing that's not really, but we already spoke about a little bit, is the fact that we did look at this from a longitudinal perspective, right? How does it evolve? Do people ever change from a group, from being private to public? And as I mentioned, we don't see this change, but instead we see that groups create sort of a secondary group that will allow them to fulfill that other purpose. And that to some extent suggests that there might be an intuitive understanding of users, right? That they kind of know the nature of the collaboration that occurs in these groups. And even though they might sometimes, when they create the channel, have a very spontaneous choice for public or private, they soon realize that these groups do evolve in different ways, and then might end up creating a secondary group that better serves their purpose in time. And I think the other thing that really emerged from this is also, and that's a project that I'm currently working on, which is not part of this article, considering that to some extent these platforms, right, in the literature, we often call them enterprise social media platforms. There's a lot of social conversations that happen in these platforms.
Yes.
What is the role of these social conversations, right, in the creative process? We know that when people feel part of a workplace, right, they feel part of an organization, like they're happy socially as well because they have pleasant contacts with their colleagues, that fuels creativity, right? It fuels productivity. So what is really the role of social conversations in sort of maybe kickstarting new creative collaborations? Do ideas that develop in these groups that exist for hobbies like cycling, do they sometimes inspire ideas in other parts of the organization that are more work related, right? There's the famous example of the Shinkansen, right? The bullet train in Japan that, that it drives through city centers very close to people's homes. And when it used to enter tunnels, it was extremely loud. And one of the engineers that was working on the project to try to reduce sort of the noise levels when these trains entered was thinking of a fishing example, and how there's a particular shape of a beak that really helps to reduce noise when the fish apparently jumps in the water, if I recall the story correctly. And so he used that sort of as a metaphor to design the nose of the train, which, the Japanese bullet train has this very characteristic nose that's very long and thin. So do we see the same in these platforms? Do we see that there's actually greater opportunity for creativity as a function of the fact that social and work-related conversations occur in the same space, that people go back and forth, as you said, because they can be part of all these different groups at the same time? They might 1 minute be typing in a group about cycling or about another hobby they have, and the next moment they're talking in a group about work, and maybe that actually helps to spur greater creativity and innovation because they can translate ideas from one context to another.
This is great. This is like so fantastic. And I'm sure that everyone involved in remote work advocacy is happy that there's really like very specific research going into some of these things. What is online collaboration and how can it be different, and how we can use technology to shape it into what we want. Is there anything else that you want to say, or anything that you're excited about in the future, Wietske?
Maybe just highlight one of the recommendations that I think is from the paper, right? That as we deal with these platforms, we often think how to manage them. But these private groups are not visible, oftentimes not even to managers, right? Maybe if they are part of the team, sure. But if they're not a part of the team, they don't see it. And I think a big takeaway here is that is okay. We need to become comfortable with the fact that we cannot always manage everything, right? We need to give some freedom and let people lead the way and explore their own thing and just have these communities develop and grow organically. But at the same time, of course, for organizations, given that we see that some of the more radical idea generation, the real experimentation, the real incubation happens in these private groups, there is the challenge then, how can we transfer some of these learnings to the rest of the organization without undermining the safety of this space? And I think this is an interesting challenge that we need to think about, right? We should not encourage managers to try to manage these, because that will undermine the dynamics that are unique to these groups. But maybe we can encourage people that are part of these groups that if there are any learnings that they feel are relevant to the broader organization, that they share them. Things that are not sensitive, things that are not confidential, things that don't reveal the entire process that led up to it, but just a final takeaway or final success story that emerged from it. Can they use public spaces to share those with the rest of the organization so that we can maintain these safe harbors for idea incubation, but also contribute to learning in the broader organization?
And this is where you get the standing ovation. Thank you very much. You have just touched on magic. Wietske van Osch, thank you very, very much for stopping by. Listeners, you can connect with our guest on LinkedIn. We'll stick the link in the show notes. Or if you want to email her, the email is vanosch, which is VANOSCH @hec.ca. Thank you very, very much. It's been really, thank you for your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me. This was a really nice conversation. Thank you.
Well, listeners, I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Isn't it great that we're having some really good research to guide how we use this technology? Because we've been making some assumptions and now we're getting really what's going on. So I am so grateful for the Sloan Review to be publishing this and for the team to have researched this. And if you are interested in this theme of how transparent should we be, how transparent should our team be, how transparent we should be as managers, then Tim and I have an episode from Management Cafe, episode number 68, and it's going to be published on the 27th of November. And I encourage you to check it out. So the show is Management Cafe. And if you're listening to this sometime in the future, it will be out. And if you're listening to this when it's released, maybe you have to wait a couple of weeks for it. So episode 68 of Management Cafe. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you want to get in touch, Pilar at virtualnotdistant.com, or you can use the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. For now, thank you very, very much for listening. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast. We know there are many other shows for you to choose from. Remember to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app, and you can check out the full show notes over at virtualnotdistant.com/podcasts. Talking of podcasts, we have another show you can listen to, Management Cafe, which you should also be able to find on all podcast apps. I have been Pilar Ortiz. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.